Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad. Tehami. The United Nations Security Council is going to hold an emergency meeting regarding Israeli airstrikes on the embassy of Iran in the Syrian capital, Damascus. Now, there is a representative of Russia at the United Nations, Dmitry Polyansky. He has said, let me quote him, in a letter sent to the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the United Nations Security Council President Vanessa Fraser, Iran's mission to the United Nations called on the world body to denounce the Israeli regime's heinous and abhorrent terrorist attack that killed 7 military advisors of the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps IRGC, unquote. Let me bring in some excerpts from this particular letter that has been written by the Iranian mission at the United Nations. The strike was a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter, international law, and the foundational principle of the inviolability of diplomatic and consular premises. Also saying it carried far-reaching international implications that can exacerbate regional tensions. The aggressor Zionist regime bears full responsibility for its consequences. Also saying that Islamic Republic reserves its legitimate and inherent right under international law and the United Nations Charter to take a decisive response to such reprehensible acts. There has been a very strong response as far as the top leadership of the Iranian side is concerned, with the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei saying that Brigadier General Mohammad Raza Zahidi, commander of the IRGC's Quds Force, and his Deputy General Mohammad Hadi Haji Rahimi were martyred in this crime perpetrated by the usurping and despicable Zionist regime. Likewise, strong-worded statements coming from Iranian President Mr. Ibrahim Raisi, from the Iranian Parliament Speaker, as well as the Iranian Foreign Minister. We have also seen strong condemnations coming from countries including Syria, Russia, China, as well as Pakistan has also condemned this particular Israeli airstrike violating international law. In today's program, we are going to talk about, given the fact there are already volatile situation in the Middle East since the 7th of October because of the brutal aggression by the Israeli regime led by its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Over 32,000 innocent lives, mostly of women and children, have been lost, and over 70,000 plus people are injured because of this brutal aggression. What was at the very first place the need of such a strike, and what sort of implications it is going to have on the wider region, and what is expected from the United Nations Security Council regarding this particular Israeli airstrike violating international law, and what sort of response could be expected from the Iranian side also. We have also seen when a spokesperson by the Israeli regime was asked about this particular airstrike, he didn't comment on this. Also talking about the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, he also didn't comment regarding this particular strike, saying that we need to know more about this particular strike. All these aspects are for discussion in today's show. For that, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Jauhar Saleem, his former Foreign Secretary. Mr. Saleem, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on the show tonight. We really appreciate that. Also, in this, on Skype, we are honored to have been joined by Brigadier Retired Saad Mohammed. He is Senior Analyst. Brigadier Mohammed, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. Let me quickly begin with you, Mr. Saleem. Now, we have also seen statements coming from the top Iranian leadership. Let me bring in a statement by the Iranian Parliament Speaker, who said this particular airstrike by Israel demonstrates the weakness, helplessness, and desperation of the usurping Zionist entity in the face of resilience and steadfastness of the resistance factions that are operating across the region. What's your understanding? Is it the depiction of the helplessness, weakness, and desperation on the part of the Israeli regime?
Well, I've seen that statement, and of course the Supreme Leader's statement as well. And of course, these are very strong statements and not unexpected, because what has taken place is not something ordinary. Many principles of UN Charter have been violated, including the principle of territorial integrity, inviolability of a country's airspace, and the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and many other aspects. And we have seen the condemnation coming from countries such as Russia, which has called a meeting in the UNSC. China has also issued a very strong statement on that. Pakistan has issued a statement, and many other countries as well, and more will follow. Now we have to remember what happened in 2020 when even a leader, even a military general of high cadre, Qasem Soleimani, was killed by the Israelis. At that point, Iranians had vowed revenge, had come up with very strong statements, of course. And subsequently, there were actions. What they did was they fired missiles at a US military base in Iraq, but there were not many casualties, though. So it was more symbolic than substantial in terms of casualties. In this particular instance, I think Israelis, like you very rightly mentioned, officially they have said, and that is their long-standing policy. They don't comment on such actions, on such attacks that they launch, and they regularly do that. But at the same time, a senior Israeli official, on the condition of anonymity, has shared with international media that they're rather accused that these two generals were involved in actions against what he termed as Israeli and American assets in that region. So that is their way of doing it. Now this, of course, like this has been termed as an act of desperation and helplessness, and that's a very strong rhetoric. From an Israeli point of view, they have been doing it for a long time. They have been taking out, like high-value targets, human targets, whoever they feel has been involved in sort of, or they take as a threat, or and multiple times they have done it at a huge cost, political cost. In this particular instance, as I've mentioned, this violates so many principles of international law, and the biggest, of course, that like most countries in the world, for most part, have always respected this diplomatic immunity and sort of this inviolability of sort of diplomatic buildings and diplomatic assets. And this was a direct military strike by F-35s, by an F-35 plane. And this is capital of Syria, another country. So that means that they did ascribe a high value to, in their perspective, taking out these targets. And I see the Iranians retaliating at some point in time, as they have done in the past as well. But it would be a measured response, as also has happened in the past. Now, I think if we move to the political ramifications in terms of what happens in the UNSC, the debate is going to happen actually this evening, US time, 3 p.m.
I see your pardon with the interjection over here.
Yeah,
if you allow me, let me bring in this particular point and what could be expected from the UNSC regarding this particular airstrike by Israel on Iranian embassy. Let me proceed towards Brigadier Mohammed. Brigadier Mohammed, what's your understanding when you talk about this statement coming from Iranian parliament speaker saying it shows the helplessness and the desperation on the part of the Zionist regime? What's your understanding? How do you look at this?
Thank you very much. Israel has been carrying out terrorist activities in various forms, where they feel that those targets could be threats to them. And there could be assassinations of nuclear scientists from Arab countries, and there could be nuclear power plants or nuclear research facilities that they think in the future could have implications on the Israeli security. And they have been doing it with impunity. Just because the European countries, that's the West, and particularly the United States, they back up Israeli, policies diplomatically, economically, and militarily. This war in Gaza, in which they have killed over 30,000, 32,000 innocent people, wouldn't have been possible had the Americans not supplied them with all the weaponry and the munitions that are required to carry out such, genocide that they have carried out. Now, the attack on Damascus by Israeli aircraft, this violates the international law, it violates the UN Charter, and it violates the diplomatic inviolability of diplomatic missions and diplomatic personnel. 7 Iranian personnel have been killed in this raid. Now, very strong statements have come from the Iranian authorities. But I would say that this is more of rhetoric than what they can actually do, because obviously they're very weak in the region and they cannot face the Israeli military might. However, as Israel thinks that such raids and such acts, they prove to be a deterrence against escalation or any threats to future Israeli security. That's what the Israelis think. But there could be some escalation, and that could be that Iran could use its proxies, particularly the Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, to create some sort of a security challenge to the Israelis in that area. But beyond that, I don't see much of what the Iranians can do militarily at this point in time.
Right, Brigadier Mohammed, when we talk about the wider conflict in the region, do you see any threat of that one escalating further, given the fact that there has been volatile situation already in the Middle East, when there has been a brutal aggression on the part of Israeli regime towards the innocent Palestinians, the kind of scale and the proportion of loss of life and damage and destruction that has been accrued later on since 7th of October? And the kind of response that we have been seeing throughout, as per the statements coming from the top Iranian leadership, and also looking at today's statements, that perhaps it is the helplessness that has been depicted because of that fight that the resistance groups are putting in against the Zionist regime.
Well, the October 7 attack was, very bold action by the Hamas, and one cannot deny them their right to fight for their freedom. Their land has been usurped, their land has been occupied, so they have a right to fight the Israeli occupation of their lands. They are willing to for a peaceful settlement, but the Israeli governments, one after the other, has refused to acknowledge that the Palestinians require a separate state and a two-state solution, which most of the world favors. Israel will not allow that. Now, what can Iran do in this particular? Militarily, it is not in a position to pose a major threat to the Israeli state at this point in time, because of the huge support that the Israeli government has from the West and from the United States. Now, this thing has gone to the Security Council. It will be debated over there, and if any resolution comes against against Israel, it will be vetoed by the United States. So it enjoys impunity. It has carried out so many in the past, ever since it became a state. Israel has been using terror as a weapon to subdue its opponents, or to kill people, or to carry out genocides. They've carried them out. They've carried them out in Lebanon. They've carried out in Syria. They've carried out in the West Bank, Gaza. So the track record shows that they have been doing it. They will continue to do it, and nothing much that the other countries will do. Iran is the only country which stands up to Israel. Yes, diplomatically, it does stand up to Israel. It tries to help the movements within the area that pose a challenge to the Israelis. However, if you look at the other countries in the region, even the country which was attacked, Syria, is not in a great position to do anything to deter such strikes on their territory. Already there's a civil war had just ended. It doesn't seem to have ended that way, but there's not much of hostile actions at this point in time. The other countries, the Arab countries, I don't think so. Most of them have had diplomatic relations with Israel. and they are not willing to confront Israel in any way. So Iran is the only country that stands alone. Uh, Whether they can do something or not, my assessment is it will not do. There could be some problems coming from Hezbollah. That's all. Hamas is not in a position at this point to carry out some military action against Israel, because most of the area has been occupied by Israeli forces, and they are fighting a battle for survival. Hezbollah is the only force available in the area which can prove some threat to the Israeli security, but not much.
Your point is well taken. Mr. Saleem, now, you already mentioned as far as the response by the Iranian side is concerned, it would be a measured response. Likewise, similar sort of view has been put forth by Brigadier Mohammed also, because of the kind of limitation the Iranian side has got. So let's go back once again in time, as you already mentioned, back in 2020, the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani and the subsequent retaliation on the part of Iranians. There were certain quarters which were of the view that perhaps there was a huge proportion of damage that accrued to the US side, but it was perhaps downplayed on their part. If you look at this particular measured response this time around, which Iranians might likely to take in the near future, this time around, how do you compare it? Would be different, or would it be more aggressive this time around, even if it is measured one as compared to the one that they took back in 2020?
This time there's a slightly different situation because of what is happening in Gaza itself. 33,000 people have been killed there, and innocent civilians, women and children, and the whole world is very provoked. The sentiment is totally against Israel, and it's Hamas and other, not just Hamas. There are others in Gaza right now, other Palestinian groups. They are involved in the resistance against Israel. Then again, there's Hezbollah, as has been mentioned by Brigadier Saab. And the Houthis, we have seen in recent days, there have been certain actions taken by the Houthis, and many analysts felt that it was on the Iranian prodding, the Western analysts mostly, of course. So I believe that this measured response is, or at least I expect that this measured response is likely to come through possibly one of these organizations, or it could be again some sort of missiles being thrown at, because there are a lot of military assets in the region that the Israelis and the US have. Having said that, I think Iranians do not want to in any way rock the boat by taking an action which would further widen this conflict. The US, they want to ensure the same, and there's been intense diplomacy going in the region. Even as we speak, the diplomacy is going on. We know there have been talks between the US and Israel only yesterday, and they are going to resume next week again. The talks about alternatives to a ground assault of Rafah. So I think in this situation, it can't be an action which would be greater than what happened the last time. Last time, like I mentioned, there was no casualties. You see, okay, buildings might have been destroyed, but for the American public, that is not important. It's always the personnel, and that something which could really create a confrontational situation between Iran and Israel, a direct confrontation, or between Iran or the US. I don't envisage that.
So when we talk about, as you already mentioned, that Iranians don't want to rock the boat this time around, and that particular response this time around is not going to be as similar to that happened in the past in the case of assassination of General Qasim Soleimani. And you also mentioned that the US doesn't want de-escalation at the same time. Also, you mentioned the diplomacy already going on. When such type of operations usually take place, when specifically in the case of Israel launching such attacks, don't you think they take their US counterparts into confidence beforehand, before going for such a strike?
I mean, this particular instance, as I mentioned, the senior Israeli official who confided to segments of media that we took this action because these two generals were involved in certain actions against their assets. They didn't mention just Israeli assets. They mentioned American assets as well. So, you know, that's quite meaningful. So that would suggest that, you know,
so if that is suggestive of the fact that perhaps the US counterparts were also in the loop regarding this particular airstrike beforehand, so how do you analyze that particular statement by Matthew Miller that we need to know more about this strike as yet?
Well, I mean, you know, that's again, that's a statement which suggested they didn't want to comment on that, obviously, you know. And the death toll has been increasing as well. Initially, you know, they were talking about 4 deaths and then 5 and then 7, and now they're talking about 11 deaths there, you know. You know, like it's unfortunate the way it has happened, of course, you know, like as I mentioned, so many principles have been violated there, and you know, and Pakistan's statement you've already seen. And other countries, and now when the UNSC meeting takes place. And by the way, I may mention that because Brigadier Saab mentioned that you know, even if there are any resolutions, they could be vetoed by the US. I think this meeting would be more a discussion, more of a discussion, and to have a resolution, you need prior preparation, and sort of, you know, then some country has to propose, unless the Russians want to propose something. But for that, voting to take place, it's not all that very quick, you know, like it takes some time. So at the most, and this is going to be an open meeting, interestingly, because the Russians have asked for an open meeting. So whatever deliberations take place would be sort of, you know, like televised or witnessed by the media. So I think in that discussion, basically, a lot of countries are likely to come up with strong statements because of the principles involved. It's not that they would be taking sides in any case or in any way. They would be basically talking about the principles that have been violated. You know, the principle of territorial integrity and inviolability of a country's sort of, you know, space, and the Vienna diplomatic conventions and other principles.
So do you expect such type of very strong-worded statements coming when we talk specifically of the principles? As you have mentioned, a couple of them now also been mentioned in that particular letter written by the Iranian UN mission. Do we expect similar sort of strong-worded statements coming from the US side also, if they would be coming from the others?
From the US side against Israel?
Regarding the principle, the violation of those principles.
Yeah.
Would it acknowledge that there was the violation of these principles?
I think I don't envisage strong statements from the US coming against Israel, because that has not happened in the past as well. But in terms of, but you know, like of course, in, you know, talking of the principles, they would have to say something. But it would be interesting to see what the other Western countries, the European countries, would be saying, because I think they could be more open. And some countries, it's very clear, like, you know, the Chinese have spoken, the Russians have spoken, Pakistan has spoken. A lot of countries, you know, the Latin American countries, I think that, you know, like, but we have to see that because it's a UNSC meeting, you know, so it's only the countries represented in that, and these are 14 countries, you know, like 15 countries, 5 permanent powers, and 10 elected countries, and Malta is the president. So only those countries can speak there, basically their representatives. And Qatar is there presently. So, but Qatar is, you know, like they have good diplomacy, but they generally come up with guarded statements, of course. So, but it's quite a, because it's based on regional sort of representation. So it's quite a mix, and I see sort of an intense debate, some strong statement, but in terms of sort of follow-up action, again it's hard to envisage sort of like, as we have already seen, there has been a UNSC resolution against this sort of like asking Israel to stop, to have a ceasefire at least for the month of Ramadan, and that has not happened. There has been other sort of ICJ's ruling recently. They've asked Israel to ensure the resumption of aid. Again, that has not happened. So to see, okay, there'll be a lot of discussion and statements and everything, but in terms of concrete action, it's hard to envisage.
Right. Let me take this very point to Brigadier Mohammed. Brigadier Mohammed, you already mentioned that if any sort of a resolution regarding this particular violation of so many principles of the UN Charter and the international law on the part of Israeli regime has taken place, the US is going to veto this. Now, let me bring in that particular statement by the first Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, Dmitry Polyansky of Russia, saying that the Iran's mission to the United Nations called on the world body to denounce the Israeli regime's heinous and abhorrent terrorist attack that killed 7 military advisors of the IRGC. Now, as per this particular statement, what the Iranian mission has sought from the United Nations Security Council seems to be only the denouncement or the condemnation of this heinous and abhorrent terrorist attack. Should there have been more ask as far as the United Nations Security Council is concerned, as far as this particular letter from the Iranian side talks about?
No, firstly, Israel has not acknowledged that it has struck the, the Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus. So even if some condemnation is there, whom do they condemn? Because there has been no investigation that Israel is guilty unless Israel itself acknowledges that it has carried out the strike. So I don't see any condemnation coming that way. And if there is something more serious to that, the United States will veto that and nothing will come out. Please look at the track record in the past. Israel has carried out blatant terrorist attacks right from the day it was created in 1948. What has been done? Nothing. The Israelis have continued to do it, and the United States and the Western countries have continued to back it. They have continued to give it diplomatic support, economic support, and military support. Nothing is going to come out of it. Now, the other problem is that Iran, poses, or the Iranian interests and those of the GCC, those of Egypt, they clash. So something that, when Israel considers Iran as a security threat, so do the GCC countries, even if they don't say it. So does Egypt, if it doesn't say it. Because if you look at the Houthi problem, it bothered the GCC so much that they went into a bombing campaign against the Houthis. So these proxy forces, which are, whether they are in Syria or whether they are in Lebanon or whether they are in Yemen, they pose threat to these countries. So the Israeli security concerns, the GCC and that of Egypt coincide. So nothing is going to happen. Iran does not have a military presence to that level to pose any threat to the Israeli security. The Israeli military might cannot be matched by any country in this region. A country like Turkey, barring some diplomatic statements of condemnation here and there, they're going to be neutral into it. They're not going to carry out anything else. So, and Mr. Erdogan would be involved more with his political opponents at this point in time, having lost the local body's election with such a massive, defeat for him. So, Israel will not only carry out attacks in the future, it's going to be defended by the United States and the West in future. It's going to be supported militarily and economically and diplomatically by the West. There is no military threat to Israel at this point in time. So Israel carries out these because it knows that to keep these threats in check, it must hit those assets which pose a threat to it. Hezbollah can only be of a limited, challenge to the Israeli army or the Israeli defense forces. They can fire some rockets and they can fire some missiles into Israel. Beyond that, they do not have any offensive capability. The Israeli defense forces has, they can move in, knock out the Hezbollah assets in southern Lebanon and come back. They have done it previously. They have gone up to Damascus, up to Beirut previously. So the Israeli defense forces have the capability. So at this point in time, we can only, just see condemnations coming in. The matter is going to go down. It's going to quieten, barring some problems by the Houthis or by the Hezbollah. Nothing else is going to happen.
Right. Mr. Saleem, looking at these statements coming from the Chinese and the Russian side, what sort of impact do you think both of these countries might have on any further proceedings, especially at the United Nations Security Council? And if nothing substantial can be envisaged, as you already mentioned, what likely influence these two countries might have regarding the overall situation in the Middle East, and not letting the escalation go beyond a further certain limited point?
I think at this point in time, the China was one of the first countries which actually came up with a strong statement on the Israeli invasion of ground assault of Gaza, when the killings of innocent civilians started in the very inception of this action 6 months back. But in recent weeks, we have seen less statements coming from China and Russia as well. They haven't really been involved very much in the diplomacy, ongoing diplomacy there. It's basically the Americans, of course, the Americans and Israelis between them, or the Israeli and Hamas like indirect negotiations, again through Americans and the Qataris and the Egyptians. So primarily it's the US, Israel, Qatar, Egypt. These are the countries which are sort of mostly involved in the ongoing diplomacy there. And these are strong statements. And Russia seems to be particularly sort of, they have taken the matter to the UN to call this emergency session, and sort of, they have, and their statement is stronger as well, compared to Chinese statement. But having said that, I do not really see these two countries getting too involved in the ongoing diplomacy there, or the ongoing happenings there, even, so to speak, because their interests in the region are not particularly tied to what is happening in Gaza. They're both the countries have interests in the region, but they are different to that. So yes, we will see sort of these maybe in the coming days. I don't really see at this point in time if the Russians will come up with a resolution, but even if that happens at some point, I think, and what we know what could be a fate of such a resolution. So
what's your understanding as far as what has been sought with the Iranian mission at the UN? Should it have been more as compared to what they've actually asked for, that the world body to denounce the Israeli regime's heinous and abhorrent terrorist attack?
Well, I mean, you see, that's the first thing they would want, like a denouncement from the United Nations Security Council itself. And we don't even know if it's going to happen, because for that there has to be a certain unanimity of views, or at least no country. I mean, if it comes to a resolution, or even if there's a joint statement of sorts. It's in diplomacy, I think. For instance, they could have said, instead of the word denounce, they could have used condemn, which is actually a stronger word. But when they, that's what they have asked at this point in time, because perhaps they thought that like condemnation would not be possible there. So and denouncement might be possible. So it's more reachable in that way. But I think it's a realistic goal. I mean, what could have they asked at this point in time? Sanctions by the UNSC, you know, like, I mean, you could ask for anything, but the point is, you know, it has to be within the bound of, you know, like what you could sort of, you know, like envisage to a certain extent.
But by bringing in such a statement, mentioning this, that the Islamic Republic reserves the legitimate and inherent right under the international law and the United Nations Charter to take a decisive response to such reprehensible acts, by adding such a statement or a warning in that particular letter, what that actually mean to get from the United Nations Security Council? This warning that it is the responsibility of the UNSC to ensure or to hold accountable the perpetrator, otherwise we do have this particular right.
Yeah.
And in the meanwhile, the UNSC should intervene before we go for that inherent and legitimate right.
Yeah. I mean, you see, they have asserted their right, which actually the United Nations Charter bestows upon, you know, upon or gives the countries, and that is the, you know, like if their sovereignty is violated, which in this case is basically the sovereignty of Syria. But at the same time, you know, there's an interesting principle involved here, because the diplomatic premises of a country becomes an extension of the territory of that country.
Exactly,
you know?
That's a very important point. That's the contentious point. The diplomatic premises
exactly
would be considered Iranian's territory, right?
Exactly. So
within
in that
a third country.
Yeah. So in that way, they could say that it's not just like that the Israelis have flouted the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations, but also their sovereignty and territorial integrity in that way, you know, because that is then part of the sort of, you know, extension of Iranians' territory abroad, because, you know, that's also a principle of sort of international law in that. So I think that's what they're hinting at. But this is a statement which is, again, a very measured statement, what they've asked from the UNSC. You know, it shows that they understand the situation. It also, when you assert your right, you know, any country would have said that in this situation, you know. So that I think that means that they are not going to be reckless, you know, in terms of their reaction or their retaliation.
Right. Brigadier Mohammed, looking at these statements by China and Russia, do you have any understanding of if any sort of an influence could be made by both these countries as far as this particular tension that has escalated between Israel and Iran is concerned?
No, I don't think so. Neither of these two countries are interested in, you know, escalating the situation further. They have their own problems. China has its own area to look after. It's already engaged in the South China Sea and Taiwan. They look at that as a priority. Russia has Ukraine on its plate. That issue has to be resolved. So both these countries are not terribly interested to, you know, get involved in the Middle East. So such statements will come. In this world, might is right. Whether we like it or not, might is right. Powerful countries, you know, get away with things. Israel is, because of the reasons that I've told you, is a very powerful country militarily. Now, there was a military strike against Iranian assets in Syria. Now, that requires a military response. Does Iran have a military response capability in the region? It does not have. For example, it will require Air Force to, you know, go for a tit-for-tat thing. There is the Iranian Air Force is, at this point, is non-existent, so they can do nothing. Yes, will Hezbollah do anything? Yes, Hezbollah will do something, maybe. Maybe Houthis do something, but they also know that, you know, going beyond a certain line will invite a response. In Yemen, the response would come from the United States and its allies. In Lebanon, Israel itself has the capability to give a strong blow to Hezbollah. Would Hezbollah want that? I don't think so at this point in time. Hezbollah would like that. So there would be some problems, but after some time it will be over.
Right, as you already mentioned, as far as the capacity or the capability for the Iranian side requiring Air Force for a tit-for-tat measure after this particular airstrike. Here's the scenario. If there doesn't happen to be an escalation, there doesn't happen to be a military response from the Iranian side of such a proportion to Israelis, don't you think it's going to embolden the Israeli regime further as far as its aggression and its intended invasion of that particular last area that is left in Gaza, of Rafah, is concerned, to which the US, its strongest ally, has not been in favor of, that Israeli regime should go for an invasion into that particular territory?
You know, the Israeli lobby within the American administration is very strong. No American president or other officials will be able to resist that Jewish lobby. So there is a very strong support in Washington for the Israelis. So Americans could, be upset with what Israel does, but they will go along with it because of the Israeli lobby. Now, what can the other countries do? I don't think so. They have any capability to do anything, and neither are they interested in doing anything. I've told you that the security interests of the GCC and that of Egypt, they coincide with Israel because they feel that Iran is a threat to their security. So whether we like it or not, it's not going to go beyond this. The Israeli assessment is that we must strike any threat in the region to Israeli security must be deterred. And this, they feel, is a deterrence. If you look at their track record, they have been doing it continuously. And they have been able to, deter threats, major threats to Israeli security. So their policy is succeeding.
Right. Mr. Saleem, very quickly, your last comments regarding, would it, if there doesn't happen to be any tit-for-tat response on the Iranian, from the Iranian side against the Israelis, wouldn't it naturally embolden the Israeli regime to further go against Rafah, to which there has been opposition by the US also continuously?
I think for that, this would not really affect that very much. That basically the discussions with the Americans, which they had yesterday and which they're going to have next week again as well, with all the, the Secretary of State led, and then the NSCs were there, Jack Sullivan was there, and of course the counterparts from the Israeli side, and then the experts were there, and the technical experts would continue that. That would be much more important as to and because and after those talks, the Americans have issued a statement saying that the Israelis have taken note of, actually there was a slightly stronger word than that, and of our concerns regarding that. So that was a positive sort of statement after the talks, indicative of the fact that there is likely to be some sort of an understanding developing in the coming days. So that is what is going to affect the course of Israel's action in terms of their plans for a ground assault. And also the other talks which are ongoing, which is the indirect talks between Israel and Hamas, facilitated by the Americans, particularly where the intelligence agencies are involved, the technical experts are involved. I think those talks would be much more relevant to what happens there. But interestingly, the other day there was a statement by President Biden that the 4 countries, in Middle East, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who may recognize Israel in a post-Gaza situation, and they will revive the two-state. They will try to endeavor to revive the two-state talks. I think that's another, and I've been mentioning that in my previous comments as well. I think that, and hopefully this is something is happening in the back channels about that as well, that possibility as well of actually, resolving this long festering conflict.
Dispute. Mr. Jauhar Saleem, former Foreign Secretary, thank you very much for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. On Skype, we were joined by Brigadier Retired Saad Mohammed, Senior Analyst. Brigadier Mohammed, thank you very much for taking time out for Views on News tonight. Really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's episode. Take good care of yourselves.